I guess would have considered myself to have been a fairly active member of the fairly hard left for about 30 years or more, starting in about 1967. And one of the things that you could be proud of, even when you had doubts about some of the ideological positions, was the attitude to fascism. No compromise with it is possible, and that's a good thing, because compromise with it isn't desirable either. A lot of people like to compare the struggle with Saddam Hussein's regime to the Cold War, to the battle against international communism, or whatever you want to call it, the Soviet design. It's a mistake, I think, to do this, because though we know that Saddam Hussein was a great admirer of Stalin's and apparently visited in his time almost all the Stalin museums that are left in Georgia and other parts of former Soviet Union, his regime is much more reminiscent of the Third Reich, not just in its police methods and its race theory against Persians, for example, which of course would be an anti-Aryan theory, technically, but in its specific party definition. I mean, the founders of the Ba'ath Party were inspired by the parties of National Socialism and Fascism in Europe. And I would say, as someone who's been visiting Iraq on and off since 1975, I think, that if I hadn't known that as a historical fact, which I do, I would have guessed it from the evidence of what I saw. The cult of the leader, the cell organization of the party, the politicization of the police and the army, the endless propaganda of hatred and fear and violence, the willingness to commit, let's call it ethnocide, against the Kurdish people, and the fundamental irrationality. The willingness to sacrifice his country's sovereignty and have it placed under international sanctions because he wouldn't come clean on WMD, because he could not renounce the ambition at any rate to acquire or reacquire them, is another sign of a very deep-seated megalomaniac, paranoid type. He must have known it was a gamble he could not possibly win. But he was willing to see his entire society be destroyed or beggared, rather than give it up, rather than simply make an open declaration and bring himself into conformity with the relevant resolutions. It is, you might say, a saving grace of fascism that it's irrational. It is self-defeating. I mean, nobody knows why Hitler decided to declare war on the United States while he was still very heavily at war with the Soviet Union and the British Empire. It wasn't the action of an intelligent person. At a certain stage in the post-Cold War, the American left in particular became a status quo force. It basically more or less liked things the way they were. You could hear people saying an American intervention to overthrow Saddam Hussein would destabilize the Middle East. Well, now, I can remember when, the idea of a stable Middle East wasn't the aim of the revolutionary left. And I can remember why as well. Also, I can remember a time when the one great cause of the left was the Kurdish Revolution. The Kurdistan question is a very old cause of the left, older than the Palestinian one, as a matter of fact. All of this was airbrushed in the feeling which I attribute very strongly to the work of Noam Chomsky, and a very widespread, if vague, feeling that American force cannot be used for moral ends. It's not a state that can act anything but selfishly or imperialistically. What this meant in practice was defending Slobodan Milosevic. It was the first post-Cold War confrontation, and then defending Saddam Hussein. Not literally saying they were okay, though I'll come to that in a minute, but saying that coexistence with them was possible, in any case wasn't worth a war, and in the third case that war would be fought for dubious reasons if it was by the United States. Now I regard that as a very conservative position. It's a position actually taken by a lot of the Republican right. Now I call that a conservative position, and in fact it is the position of quite a lot of the Republican right, the isolationists, and always has been. You hear that kind of talk from Pat Buchanan, and you used to hear it from Robert Taft. Though they don't include the moral condemnation of the United States. In effect, the left had adopted a conservative position, or a lot of it had. It doesn't take very long for the conservative position, when it continues to grind against reality, to become a reactionary one. You could get the impression from reading, say, the arts pages of the New York Times, or the Washington Post, that Michael Moore was just the low IQ, large print version of Noam Chomsky. Chomsky for idiots. That's not true, in my opinion. Noam Chomsky, for all his faults, is not a paranoid nor a fabricator. Noam Chomsky is interested in the clash of social and political forces and classes and so forth. Michael Moore is much more like a brown shirt looking for hidden financial conspiracies. And that's not even a vulgar form of Marxism. It's actually a great deal more like fascism, because the suggestion about hidden financial cabals is always tainted with bigotry. And it's only one step, and often not even that far, to that. In the 1950s, there was quite a widespread movement in the United States called the John Birch Society, founded by a man called Robert Welch. And Mr. Welch made himself extremely famous by saying that President Eisenhower was a dedicated and conscious agent of the international communist conspiracy. And lots of people believed that. And I wondered what their lives were like. You know, you get up in Pasadena or wherever you live, Chappaqua, Arlington, you think, oh, it's another day. The President of the United States is being run by the Kremlin. I guess I've still got to go get the groceries, drop off the kids, you know. But all this raging is going on inside your skull all the time. It doesn't, in one sense, make any difference. It's probably even maybe therapeutic for some deeply disordered people. Suppose everything that was in Michael Moore's film was true, and I think I could actually say that almost nothing in it is, but suppose everything was true, what conclusion would people draw? How would it mobilize them politically? It's a form of escapism, I suppose, and a form of consolation for political defeat, and a form of denial, because if we are in a desperate struggle to save Afghanistan and have an election there and fight off and destroy the Taliban forces and the Al-Qaeda forces, not because that's what we really have to do and they forced us to take this stand, but because of a secret understanding to build a pipeline that was actually the Unocal scheme. I happen to know about it, I've known about it for a long time, was cancelled in 1998. But the discovery that the thing was cancelled in 1998 and the Al-Qaeda attack on New York is 2001 doesn't change anyone's mind who sees the film. There just must be something else they're not telling us. So that's what it's all about. It's nothing like what it seems. Well, this is preaching moral idiocy. So in one mood, I think, okay, it's harmless and I can ridicule it. And in another mood, I think it's dangerous and one must confront it very critically, because if you're spreading credulity and stupidity around the place, then you're inviting the spread of something that can be exploited by people even more unscrupulous than yourself. And there are people who are even more unscrupulous than Michael Moore.